pretty nice sort of political resonance for the play and performance, one might suppose. And, of course, by this time, 1600 or so, Queen Elizabeth was very close to the end of her life, very old, and although she was much worshipped as a very beautiful woman, the appearance tends to be otherwise, doesn't it? In fact, we were talking about this earlier today. There's an image in the graveyard scene in Hamlet when Hamlet, holding the skull of Yorick, preaches to the skull, as it were, saying that any woman, may she paint with an inch thick of makeup over herself, she will come to this, that she will come to death, come to the skull, and so on. I don't know that that's ever been pointed out as related to, again, to the very late years of Queen Elizabeth, but that's actually a rather interesting resonance that might have struck some of the people in Shakespeare's audience. So at any rate, the role of Ophelia at the court of Denmark and so on bears striking resemblances to what people would have been hearing all the gossip about and talking about themselves in terms of the way Elizabeth related to, especially the women in her entourage. If we move forward a little bit in time, we don't have much record about the performance in the 17th century, although it seems to have been popular quite through until the theaters were closed in 1642. When the theaters opened at the Restoration period in 1660 in London, Hamlet was in fact the first play to be staged with what the new form of scenery. Now, they're no longer the Elizabethan theater. There were a series of indoor houses that were used in those early years of the Restoration. They didn't really have a building yet. They soon had some very handsome buildings. Christopher Wren came through as an architect, and so the play as a whole seems not to have been much tampered with compared with other Shakespeare plays. You probably all know that King Lear was worked up into a happy ending by Nan Tate during the Restoration period, the end of the 17th century. Something of a major change. Many of the comedies were hugely altered by importing parts of one into another, importing songs or comic routines or characters, indeed, from one comedy into another. They generally felt the view in the Restoration period that they had to adapt the play to current Restoration tastes, which were for Wycherley and Congreve and sort of racy comedies of that sort, which had been brought over essentially from French taste in the 17th century, from Molière and the like. And so Shakespeare underwent quite a sea change. Hamlet seems to have been regarded with rather more sort of veneration as a play that didn't have to be or shouldn't be subjected to that kind of rewriting. It was shortened. In fact, there's evidence, internal evidence, but very compelling evidence really, that the play was too long ever to have been acted in its entirety probably until Kenneth Branagh, as a matter of fact. His film was a 4-hour version, and then recently Mark Rylance did one in the Globe Theatre in London. So there have been attempts to do 4-hour productions. Very recently, but not until then. It's just the internal evidence is that sort of in London, especially during the season of the year long about now, that the day comes to an end rather quickly, especially it's a more northerly climate than here in terms of the visibility of the sun in the winter, and people had to get back from the other side of the Thames to the city of London itself by water taxi or by London Bridge, so that when the chorus in the beginning of Romeo and Juliet talks about the 2-hour traffic of our stage, that's a round figure, but he doesn't say the 3-hour traffic of our stage, which would work just as well metrically. And it does seem to suggest that they performed very rapidly and that they were accustomed to cutting. And there's lots of other evidence from the version of the text itself. The first quarto is a very cut version. The cuts may represent cut versions for performance. And this seems altogether likely. Shakespeare, who's had a reputation for being not only gifted, but a very prolific writer, very facile, he wrote fast. Ben Jonson once quipped about him. He's often said he never blotted a line. Would he had blotted 1,000, said Ben Jonson, because he was a new classical critic and thought Shakespeare wasn't sufficiently correct. But Shakespeare seems to also just pour it out of him. He was writing, and then one could imagine him taking this play to the company and they're saying, "Oh, Will, this is really wonderful stuff. Now, could you give us an acting version that we could actually put on in 2 hours and a half?" We don't know that for sure, but it's, the evidence is suggestive that that's what happened. So it was cut. There are various ways of doing that. Olivier's version points to one that became quite common, which is to leave out all of Fortinbras and altogether. If you take out that plot, you can get rid of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. That's another choice. Now, I'm more interested from the point of thinking about Ophelia, to think about the kinds of cuts that would be useful to try to clean up her act, as it were, or Hamlet's relation to her. There are things that you get to the later 17th century and on to the 18th century that started to bother audiences a lot. And this goes down to David Garrick, who was, of course, the great actor manager at the end of the 18th century, who had huge success, became enormously wealthy, was buried in Westminster Abbey and so on, just a masterful person, who also, by the way, established Stratford upon Avon as the sort of shrine for William Shakespeare. They had a great jubilee there, for a 3-day jubilee in which no Shakespeare was performed, but David Garrick, the great point was Garrick's reciting his ode on the birthday of William Shakespeare. It struck him. He'd never tampered with Hamlet seriously before, but he really thought he would try it. And then afterwards he was crestfallen. He thought he'd made a terrible mistake. The sorts of cuts that might come up through this and on of the 18th century. Bawdry. There's a delightful passage when Hamlet and Ophelia and the rest are waiting for the murder of Gonzago to go on as the play with which Hamlet himself has hired the actors to perform as a way of catching the conscience of the king. And we see this as a play, watching actors on stage watching a play, and as they're waiting to start and so on, Hamlet approaches Ophelia. The king and queen are already there, and he says, "Lady, shall I lie in your lap?" She says, "I don't know, my lord." She says, "I mean with my head in your lap. Did you think I meant country matters?" And he presumably lays sufficient emphasis on the word country to make an obscene pun, and when she blushes at that, and she says, "I know nothing, my lord." And he says, "Well, that's a fair thought to lie between this lady's legs." And she says, "What is, my lord?" And he says, "Nothing." That's about the bawdiest passage in Hamlet. It's not a especially bawdy play. That gets cut quite quickly, but as audiences found that offensive. More seriously, there is the matter of Hamlet's killing her father and driving her mad and being responsible, if you like, and I think most people saw that they could really hold him responsible for Ophelia's madness and death, even if she falls. We'll talk about that. If she falls in the water and drowns, whether it's regarded as a suicide or not became a big question. But the question of the extent of culpability of Hamlet and the misfortunes of Ophelia and what to make of this, reflecting upon him, as audiences by this time not only wanted to resuscitate the character of Ophelia, but to improve the character of Hamlet, so that he would be an ideal prince, especially in the early 19th century with the Romantics, Hazlitt and so on, praising him as a thoughtful, introspective, philosophical person, such a wonderful critic of the universe and humanity's place in it, and so on, that you want him to be an ideal hero for a tragic play. Well, there are lots of problems, including, obviously, the killing of Polonius and all that follows from that. Another point, I'll come back to this in a moment, but another point that becomes troubled is the scene that is not actually staged on the stage, when Ophelia comes in to her father and says, "Oh, my lord, I've been so frighted." "What's the matter?" he asks, and she says, "Well, Hamlet came into my chambers just now, with no hat upon his head, with his stockings fouled down around his ankles, and in complete emotional distress, and takes me by the arm and staring at me, backs out the door with his eyes bending on me at the very last moment." And she's petrified by that, goes to her father, who then, of course, takes the story to the king.